Now, Mr. Agnew is the first.
Thank you. Not to put a pun on the word elephant, because we're talking about Africa, but there is an elephant in the room here which just hasn't been mentioned, and that is the impact of the Chinese effectively colonizing Africa. I mean, they are everywhere now, buying up huge tracts of land or leasing it, taking control over the minerals. This is reality. This is happening. And does the EU or Europe have any part to play in Africa anymore? We can wring our hands with guilt about the colonial era 100 years ago. Meanwhile, we watch China take it one step further. They look at Africa as their vegetable garden, in effect. And so I'd like to ask the Commission, have you come up against China in your forays into Africa? Because if you haven't already, you will do soon. And when you do, who's going to win? Who's going to blink first? Are we going to say, right, this is the Chinese area of operation, because the Africans themselves just do not seem to be able to get up and go, despite the facilities and the resources they've got there. Why haven't we mentioned China? And if we do mention it, what are we going to do about it? Thank you.
Mr. Agnew, I think you're absolutely right. That is a serious issue which we're not tackling head-on in the Commission or the European Union. I don't think one can assume that all of the Chinese footprint in Africa is negative, but clearly some of it is. Some of that presence is the Chinese private sector. Some of that presence is state enterprises, so the Chinese government indirectly. Some of the investment, I think, is actually beneficial for the countries in question. China provides a lot of infrastructure, roads, railway links, ports, etc., which are of benefit for the African countries. But I think it's probably true that some of the investment or the presence in China is detrimental. It is, as you said, it's large-scale farming of sole commodities for export in order to strengthen China's food security and not the food security of the African country in question. And sometimes that investment is the product of political leverage, a large country with a very small country. In the G20 framework, we've been working hard to try to get an agreement amongst the G20 countries, that includes China, on the importance of responsible investment in Africa. There are rules and guidelines from the OECD and elsewhere that set out what investors should and should not do. And so to the extent that the Chinese government has control over its investors, they have signed on to those guidelines. And you'll remember that when Xi Jinping went to Africa a couple of years ago, he apologized for the rapacious behavior of some of the Chinese companies in the previous years and said that he would try to rectify that. Whether he has done so or not, I frankly don't know. Within the EU-Africa relationship, we are also with the African Union, and this is something that we hope to secure at the summit next week. We are establishing a set of guidelines that would be signed on to by both the governments and by the private sector on what is a responsible investment approach from the private sector, and what kind of governance and conditions African countries should provide in order to attract the right kind of investment. So I hope with that step forward, we can demonstrate that it's in the interests of our African partners to encourage responsible investment rather than some of the more nefarious Chinese or indeed the Gulf investment.
On China, I just came from Maputo two weeks ago, Mr. Agnew, and the Chinese there are building a bridge connecting Maputo, the bridge in Maputo, costing $800 million. So they have a footprint there, clear footprint. And if you look at Mozambique on the Human Development Index, it is number 181 out of 190 countries. So it's amongst the 10 poorest countries in the world. Now, 800 million euro bridge, dollar bridge, vis-a-vis what the potential is of Mozambique. This is an enormous country. It has a coastline of, I think, 2,500 kilometers. Big potential, nothing in terms of agricultural industrialization. Very subsistence. Do we want to... the Chinese are in parts of Mozambique, yes, but we want clearly to show a model which is an inclusive type of business model, and not necessarily the model that the Chinese have been trying to sell to the African continent. A model which empowers youth, gives rights to, on land tenure to indigenous communities, and also social and environmental conditions. And that is the big dilemma we always confront, whether our standards... We just had a discussion with European financial intermediaries. These are the intermediaries between us in the EIP and those which will be sort of the bridge builders to make bankable projects. And they told us, look, if Europe wants to insist on high social standards, high environmental standards, then it's very difficult to get bankable projects in Africa, because your requirements will be very demanding in terms of smallholder communities, rather than the model that some others are selling. This is our model. Clearly, we can adjust, but not adjust to the, in terms of sort of dumping certain standards and principles that we have close to our hearts. As John said, our only forum where we can engage with the Chinese, and when I was in Mozambique, the countries which are present there are not much the European countries. It's China, Turkey, and India. Those are the three key players, not in agriculture only, but in terms of construction, development. It is these three countries which are really there. And I think what needs to be done is that within the G20 context, we engage more systematically with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the Turks, in terms of what the model and modus operandi is, and what principles we want to have, and also discuss with players like the African Union to see which models are best suited for Africa for the next 20, 30 years.